So, good morning, everyone. I know I've already introduced myself in the chat, but my name's Oliver Townsend. I'm the Head of Connections and Change for Platform. And today we're going to be talking about how do we campaign for local change. And I've put the spoiler, so if you're really busy, you can log off now. You've got the spoiler for the whole of the session, which is you always have more power than you think. And that's one of the big ways I want to frame this session today, because in the systems we have, political, policy, engagement, however you want to describe the systems, it's very common for people to feel powerless, like their voice doesn't make a difference. And so one of the big things I want to leave you with today is knowing that, yes, you can make a difference, even if sometimes it feels really hard. So a bit about me, I've worked for Platform for 3.5, coming up to 4 years. I lead their policy and campaigns work along with my colleague Jen Daffin. Prior to that, I worked for 6 years in a homelessness organisation campaigning for homelessness funding. And my background outside of professional world has been standing for election and campaigning as well, although that life is now nicely behind me. So that's a bit of context. So I've done a few campaigns, you might be able to say. Whether they're successful or not is for other people to judge. Is this moving forward? There we go. So first of all, some of you would have seen this already, so I won't spend too long on this, but what is Platform trying to change? So for us within Platform, we rebranded in 2019. Now, when most organizations talk about a rebrand, they mean fussing around with the colors or the branding or the logo. We did that as well, don't get me wrong. But what we also did was look really deeply about what we stand for as an organization. So there was a sense that we had in the period leading up to 2019 that we were still part of the problem, that we were tinkering around the edges. We weren't maybe delivering the services. We knew we were delivering good services, but were we challenging the system? So these are two images that we often use to describe kind of what we were doing prior and what we're trying to do now. So before, we used to be like people in those suits. We used to be looking at people who were coming into our services and trying to support them with just their problems without actually looking deeper. And now as an organization, we're trying to really understand, well, what's actually driving that disconnection? What's actually driving people's experiences and realities of the mental health system and also wider systems like housing and social care? So this is one of the big things that we are trying to do at Platform, is to help people to shift the narrative around mental health, so that we understand all of these different complex factors that play a key role in determining that mental health. So when we look at things like physical health, for example, we are all quite comfortable, or we are growing to be quite comfortable with the fact that living in housing with mold or damp, or living around high levels of air pollution might leave our physical health feeling not so good. There's lots of studies, for example, which demonstrate that living around areas of high air pollution can lead to lung disease, lung cancer, and so forth. But what we're not fully ready yet as a society to do is to really understand that those same things that lead to poor physical health can also play a role in determining our mental health. And that then, once you accept that that is the case, that mental health is complex and there's multiple factors that can help determine our mental health, you then start having to, you have to ask why. Why is that the case? And that's what leads Platform then to become Platform for Social Change, and why we're campaigning to make that difference, because it is our public policy choices that have created the system that are therefore determining our mental health. So what do we do? And, in terms of the strengths-based learning network, the different strengths-based examples of people working across the sector that we've spoken about, things like coaching, things like walking alongside people in their journeys, things like local area coordination, whatever model or approach it is people are using to try and support a strengths-based approach. we know that we need to dig deeper, that it's not just a question of adopting a certain model and then, hey presto, people will fall in line and suddenly be fixed and, you know, doing really well. What we absolutely have to do as services and as systems is really understand what's beneath it, what's at the heart of people's distress. And that's where people's roles on the ground, working with people, become really, really important. So what do we mean then when we talk about influencing within platform? So we are quite clear that our influencing strategy, the way in which we campaign in platform, is a mental health intervention in and of itself. That sounds like a lot of fancy words. So what do we actually mean by that? Well, a lot of the time, campaigns, traditional campaigns, are seen as a sort of cause and effect. You campaign for something, and that something is either achieved or it isn't. So the actual strategy, the campaign influence, whatever the mechanisms you use to achieve that change, are almost immaterial to the result. What we believe at Platform is the act of campaigning, the act of influencing is just as important. And one of the reasons we believe that is the importance of storytelling. So a lot of the time, we understand that stories are incredibly effective at generating change, but we also believe stories are really effective at helping people understand what's happened to them and being able to advocate from their own positions of power, however hard it is for them to find that power. So we believe that when people come together and share their stories, whether it's about mental health system, whether it's about housing shortage, whether it's about poverty, whether it's about absolute degradation of communities, we believe that when people come together and share those stories, it creates a really powerful movement for change. And the act of telling those stories can be healing in and of itself. It can also be harmful. We're not black and white with that, but generally when people get together and say, yes, this happened to me as well, we're really clear that it can drive change. So what is the link between the strengths-based working learning program and campaigning? Because sometimes it can seem like a bit of a stretch. So my experience within Platform, I spent 1 to 2 years delivering the coaching work within Platform based on the Mayday Trust person-led transitional strengths-based approaches. And one of the key things there was that we didn't want our coaches to be passive bystanders to injustice. So when you are working with people and when you're adopting a coaching approach, you can see, I've put there, it acts like a magnifying glass. Because if you're walking alongside people and you're working with them in terms of what they want to do, what are the things that they really want to work on, what are the things that they are passionate about, you can start understanding the barriers, the things that get in the way. And if you're acting as a coach and you're empowered within your role to really challenge those barriers, to really ask people to think differently, it really does put under the magnifying glass how impenetrable some of those barriers can be. So that's what we've learned from delivering coaching, is that our coaches are working with people and they're getting more and more frustrated because they're working with people in situations of high levels of distress, disconnection, despair. And what we're saying to those coaches then is, well, you know, if we can campaign, if you can help those people campaign or deliver local change with whether it's your officers or counsellors, actually that could make a huge difference for people. But that's also why we've come to you today with this course, with this session, because one of the big responses we got back within Platform when we tried to adopt it and also across Mayday Trust's network was, yeah, but it's hard. How do we do it? What do we do? Who do we talk to? How do we talk to them? So today is partly about that. I won't be able to give you all the answers in an hour. I can't teach you how to campaign. And the spoiler for that is because there is no one way to campaign. You know, anything I say today is not saying that this must be how you do it. I'm not going to give you a rule book. But hopefully what I am going to do is give you Platform's perspective based on some of my experience as well. So we've also learned with coaching in general that understanding the community is critical, that understanding what's around people is really important. But looking after ourselves is really important as well. So a lot of coaches will throw themselves in, or any professionals really, not just coaches, but this is from our experience, will throw themselves into trying to make huge changes and actually will burn themselves out along the way. So it is sort of becomes almost so repeated, it's become almost a cliche. But I will keep repeating it because we're not very good at it in this sector. So we need to look after ourselves. Sometimes change takes a long time. And if we are going to really be really committed to change, we need to be in it for the long haul. And that means prioritizing our own self-care, whatever that looks like. But then also understanding others can create connection. So a lot of the time, some of our coaches have had the greatest successes by trying to understand where other professionals are coming from, so that when they are talking about making change, they can understand actually what is it that's getting in the way. You know, it's very easy to fall into an antagonistic kind of relationship, making assumptions about other people's values or where they're coming from. And actually, a lot of the time, when we take the effort and the time to understand people's experiences around us, it can help unlock some of those difficult challenges as well. And I'll come on to that in more detail after. So system change, above all else, is relational. So as is campaigning. So the act of campaigning, the act of making change is about understanding the relationships people have to each other and to the things you want to change. So in order to develop that slightly, what I've done is looked at some of the work that we've done within Platform in terms of understanding. We use the model called circular security. Some of you have been on this training, different training for the last, throughout the strength-based program, will have seen this before already. But essentially, this is saying that people as human beings need certain things in order to thrive. And we have all, through our different parental relationships or primary caregiving relationships, have got our own different relationships to each other. And this is not exhaustive. This is not saying that this is how everyone acts, but these are basic needs. So this idea that people need a secure base to go out and explore, and this idea that people need comfort and understanding when they come back in, either to celebrate with you or to understand what's happened to them or to find comfort. So that is on an individual level, the kind of attachment that we would really like to see. And when that's disrupted in any way, people will start acting in different ways. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this circle because I could spend ages on it, and we've done that in previous sessions. So please feel free to watch the mental health recorded session as well. But fundamentally for us here, it's about, in order to generate and create really positive relationships, it's about being bigger, stronger, wiser, and kinder. And you can see in the bottom, that's what those hands look like. So that's about not being petty. That's about being someone that can be relied on, someone who's able to go, hold complexity, be quite wise about things, go, okay, understand why that might be happening. And kind. Kind is a hugely overused term because we don't understand sometimes what kind means. So being kind doesn't mean nice. It doesn't mean insipidly allowing everything to happen to you, because that wouldn't be strong. So being strong is about holding firm boundaries. Being kind is not doing it in a way that will actively cause harm or taking any pleasure out of setting those boundaries. It's about saying, no, you need to have some guidance, you need to have some support, you need to have some people taking charge occasionally, but really about giving people that space to do what they need to be done. So at Platform, we've taken that further forward and started thinking, well, okay, if that's what people need on an individual level, what is it that they need at an organizational level? So again, taking the same approaches, but saying, well, actually, as a manager, sometimes you do, as a manager, need to take charge, or as a chief executive, need to take charge. But other times, actually, it's really positive to encourage colleagues to go out and take their lead. So still following these examples, but definitely doing so in that bigger, stronger, wiser, and kinder way. So when I looked at this, and with my long experience of campaigning, I thought, oh, that's not how we campaign, though. Normally when we campaign, we do a lot of shouting, and we do a lot of attacking, and we do a lot of dividing lines, and I'll go into a bit of that later. So I started to think, well, what could it look like if we started adopting this model for a relationally informed system change or relationally informed campaigning? And we're still working on it. It's the spoiler alert again. I keep giving you these spoiler alerts. Someone's watched Doctor Who recently. So you can understand now, actually, that if we start approaching the same way we consider relationships to our organizations and to our own lives, how different it is when we're campaigning. And there's lots of reasons for that. I'm not saying people have done awful things by campaigning differently. And actually, we've had huge successes in terms of campaigns over the years, things like civil rights, where we haven't always held this sort of relational circle. However, I would always argue that that's because there's been a combination of sometimes people taking charge and setting their own boundaries, and other times have been people listening and really trying to understand. Great. Does that make sense so far? I might pause there and see if anyone's got any comments or observations. I know I'm flying through this at the moment, but we will get to some practical tips. Can't see any yet, so I will go on. The second, I suppose, element we wanted to discuss today is that system change is complex. So very often, and I absolutely hold my hand up to this, I've spent a long time working in policy, and I will sit there reading a policy document or a piece of legislation, and I'll go, do you know what? This would all be fixed if only we could implement this one small piece of legal reform or this one bit of change. And that makes me feel really better because I can go out and campaign for that one little bit of change or this one piece of funding or this one movement. And actually, the reality is that it is much more complex than that. We see a couple of, so Tanya's got a hand up. Tanya, did you want to come in with a question?
No, all. I'm very, very sorry. That was a complete accident.
Oh, no, that's fine. Oh, you're keeping me on my toes, though. I appreciate that. Brill. So, however, that doesn't work. So that's me in the room with my little tie, and I'm in my previous role. I'm looking at homelessness legislation, and I'm going, do you know what? It would be a lot easier if we adopted a mandatory blah, blah around housing allocations. It doesn't matter what the policy is, but I've nailed it, right? I've sat there, I've done it, and I'm literally talking to you about what I've actually done in my life. This is an honest admission of what I do or have done. And I would be in that room with other policymakers, and we'd have, I'm glad, yes, they've all got cups of tea there, because we'd all have cups of tea. Or if it had been a particularly hard week, we'd be in the pub at the end of a Friday, and we'd be there and we'd be absolutely solving it all. And my God, those diagrams would be things of beauty, and you'd have a brilliant Gantt chart. We'd work out exactly what kind of change we'd want. And then we'd go and actually talk to people like that poor person opening the door, and you realize that that just isn't how systems work. It doesn't mean that sometimes you don't need to campaign on a change. It doesn't mean that sometimes things aren't obvious about the changes that need to be made. But the idea that you can have a really simplistic change that takes you from A to B is just not true. And it does a disservice, I think, to campaigns and policy and politics in general to pretend that it is that simple. This is why I'm going to be very unpopular for a second. This is why it absolutely drives me mad when politicians are asked for a yes or no answer. You know, even the politicians I highly dislike, and we're during an election, so I won't go into the details of who those are, but even those that I dislike, if you are asked a simple question and a journalist says yes or no, I always think back to this image because it's not possible. For example, watching the ITV debate a couple of weeks ago, and when, you know, fix the NHS, you've got 45 seconds, tell us what you're going to do. And I was thinking, well, you can't fix the NHS in 45 seconds. You can't fix the NHS in 45 years. So actually, what is it? What kind of situation are we creating when our media ask for yes or no questions? We, as voters, we want yes or no questions, and politicians are trained to try and give things that sound like yes or no questions, but never are. So how do you fix the NHS? Well, actually, what you need there is at least a good solid 2 or 3 minutes to understand the interrelation between social care, health, social determinants, poverty. And once you've started doing that on a media interview as a politician, you've already lost the argument. So there's something critically flawed with how our system works in terms of how we think about issues. That doesn't mean that our values are not simple. I need to stress that. Sometimes it's okay to respond very simply about values and about beliefs. It's about the solutions and understanding the system that is really complex. So what do I mean when I talk about complex? And you'll notice that sometimes I'm getting better at it, but sometimes I correct myself if I talk about complicated or complex. And the reason for that is what's in front of you. So in order to understand any kind of system change or campaigning, we need to understand that certain systems look and feel and act in different ways. So they're simple or obvious. So that's like baking a cake. I always use bake a cake, even though every time I put it in, I always think actually that's not fair because I can't bake a cake for love or money. But the principles of baking a cake are pretty similar. You know, generally, I remember one time I put the milk in after something and nothing would bind. And I remember saying to my husband, what have I done? And he went, well, you've put the milk in after and it's already bound and it's not. Anyway, a chemical process, A plus B equals C all the time, pretty much religiously. And so as a result of that, you can practice it. You can get really good at it. You can make sure, well, okay, if I know that A plus B equals C, if I know that butter plus flour equals X, then the more I do it, I can learn what works really well. People say, I don't know, make sure your hands are cold before mixing dough or something. I don't know. But anyway, there's lots of tricks you can adopt. You can generate what's called the domain of best practice. Then there's complicated, so made up out of lots of those simple processes. So lots of A plus B equals C, but there's so many of them and they're also interrelated that they become complicated. And generally, without making any assumptions about anyone on the call, you need to have huge expertise in that specific complicated area to be able to do it. So the example I've used there is rocket science. You know, I could not build a rocket ship. I couldn't even build a clock or a watch because those are complicated and they need key bits of expertise that you've trained in or been educated in. The third one is complex. So, and that's herding cats or managing humans or systems. This is a crucial bit, systems that are made up of people. Because people, as much as we try and pretend this is the case, people are not predictable. You know, there's a huge amount of progress being made in behavioral psychology, behavioral science, but even so, people do not always react in the same way that you want them to. And chaotic is, as you can see, it's a big fire. You know, there's no structure, there's no order, no routine. And often that's where our services go into, say, during a crisis. So the area where I want to focus on today is complex. And what happens in our politics and our campaigning is we have a complex situation and our politicians go to complicated responses. So classic example is welfare reform. There's a problem. First of all, I would argue whether this is a problem or not, but let's take it at face value. There's a problem. There are too many people in the United Kingdom who are not able to work. Again, I stress this is not my view, but let's take it at face value. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. Okay, what we need to do then is we need to make sure we've got a very rigid managerial structure on top of our welfare reform, on top of our welfare system. We need to have multiple checks and balances. We need to have really clear forms, which end up being really complicated forms. We need to have set appointment times. We need to have sanctions, and it all becomes this hugely complicated house of cards that are resting on a system, and they're like oil and water. You cannot manage a complex system with complicated processes. It doesn't work because complex systems are not predictable in the same way. We are not robots. We are not components of a rocket ship. We are not parts of a watch. We are human beings who love, laugh, lie, manipulate. You know, we are human beings and we all act in different ways. So there's a lot more to the Cynefin model than just that. But that's a helpful way, I think, of understanding, well, actually, in terms of campaigns, what are we actually trying to achieve? What are we here to do? And are we asking for something that is a complicated or even worse, a simple response to a complex problem? So how do we embrace complexity in our campaigning? Well, one of the things Platform is starting to look a lot more at is this idea between old power versus new power. And old power, it always reminds me a little bit of, there's an old phrase, old slogan that says, all politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And that's always stayed with me because, you see it throughout campaigning, we're going to fix this, your dreams, your ambitions. And people, yes, we love dreams and ambitions, we're going to vote for them. And then when you get to it, well, we didn't really know what those dreams or ambitions were. So instead, we're going to institute policy A. There's always a difference between governing and campaigning. But in addition as well, our whole systems are set up based on, like I said, managerialism, that sort of idea of what we've got at the moment in the United Kingdom and a lot of the Western world, which is called representative democracy or representative governance. So we vote as a group of citizens for another group of citizens, and we abscond, we give, we trust our decision-making power to them. That's why we don't have too many referenda or referendums, never sure about the plural, in this country, because our model is not that. We give MPs or MSs in Wales or MSPs in Scotland, we trust them with the decisions. We also talk about competition a lot. So, if you look at the third sector and public sector, there's a lot of competition around, whether it's competition for jobs, whether it's competition for funding, whether it's competition for attention. That's very much a feature of the current system. Very clear delineation as well. Well, this is really confidential. This is our information. This is something the public sector needs to know. You see that a lot in the NHS, where it takes significant amounts of whistleblowers to get any progress made on some of the cultures of damage that some parts of the NHS have seen or been part of. Also, a very big focus on professionalism and specialization. So we are the professionals, we understand this, we are the only ones who can make this decision. And also long-term loyalty. So, privileging and prioritizing people, say, who've been part of a political party for 20, 30 years, rather than someone who's joined a week ago, rather than prioritizing and privileging the ideas and the passion and the work. You contrast that to new power values. So here we can see radical transparency, open source sharing information, commitment to what's called networked governance. So actually lots of different people holding different people to account. It's not all held together in one, for example, board structure in a charity. And also what's really interesting to me is this idea of this short-term conditional affiliation. So what that means is actually, you've got to work to keep me. You've got to work to keep my trust and keep my loyalty. There's this old idea, for example, about it's called political cleavage, where people will cleave to a particular party. So the old examples are union member would traditionally vote Labour, small business owner would traditionally vote Conservative, university students, at least till 2011, would vote Lib Dem. There would be certain groups of people that would almost, and stereotypically, obviously, but as a rule, the majority would support a certain party. We are starting to see a shift away now from different groups starting to go, actually, what are more union members voting Green or different parties? We're starting to see some of those traditional power structures starting to break out of those stereotypes. That doesn't mean, by the way, that all old power values are not useful. And what we try and see at Platform is they're both useful in different ways. So Barack Obama in his fundraising campaigns, for example, and Bernie Sanders in his campaign did huge amount of new power. They devolved a lot of their fundraising. They trusted people to just go and do it themselves. Or when you look at some really successful political movements or campaigning movements, a lot of them are not even held by any kind of central structure. So Black Lives Matters, for example, or the Me Too movement, there isn't a central Black Lives Matters committee that plans all of the anti-racist action across the Western world. Absolutely not. Instead, it's devolved, people just join in. And, there's huge strength to that. There's some weaknesses as well, because it's become very easy for parts of the media to pick out one or two people who might be doing something in, say, a way that a majority of people might not like. But actually, in general, it works really well at getting the brand out. It becomes a movement rather than a political campaign. So there's huge power in new power. But obviously, as well, just to reiterate, we're not saying that the old power values, we're not saying being a professional is a bad thing or being specialized is a bad thing, but there is that tension between actually what do we want to see in terms of campaigning. Does that make sense so far? Just pause again to see if any questions have come in. Great, I'll move on. So, connection makes change. So there's three slides here which talk about the different ways in which connection can drive change quite clearly. I need to stress that things I'm about to talk about are not, I'm not saying these are the single cause of something. Campaigns are much more complex than that. However, there are some commonalities. So Stephen Lawrence's dad, brilliant campaigner, huge movement around him. One of the pivotal points of that campaign for justice came when the Daily Mail, of all papers across the United Kingdom, not the one you would expect to do that, put on the front page about the men who had killed Stephen Lawrence. The story about how that came about is fascinating and would encourage people to read it. Essentially, Stephen Lawrence's dad knew Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail. I think he did work on his house or something. And prior to the Daily Mail putting on the front page about the Stephen Lawrence's killers, the Daily Mail had published a story which had the typical Daily Mail approach, one might suggest, where they had people who were rioting put on the same page as Stephen Lawrence protesters. And actually, Paul Dacre, according to this story on the BBC, was then spoken to by Stephen Lawrence's dad, who said, "You knew him. Why would you do that?" And afterwards, Paul Dacre put the Stephen Lawrence killers on the front page and said, "If we're wrong, sue us." Now, the Daily Mail did not bring Stephen Lawrence's killers to justice. Of course not, because it took a long series of campaigns and campaigners to do that. But that personal relationship, that ability for someone to say, "No, you knew my son. You knew he wasn't XYZ. What are you doing?" That humanity, that human connection meant that even someone with as much influence and distance from people as Paul Dacre, who is, read a lot more about him. He's not someone that I would, for example, have a cup of tea with. But that personal connection drove such a huge amount of change. So what am I trying to say there? I'm not saying that we need to suddenly buddy up with people that we vehemently disagree with. I'm not saying that we need to necessarily campaign on or with or for the Daily Mail. What I am saying, though, is that personal relationships can make change in ways we never thought possible. So there's something there when we're thinking about how we campaign, understanding that talking to people, seeing them face to face, talking about what we are actually like, not what you think we're like, is really important. And you can see that then from a national perspective. And if you've never seen the film Pride or read some of the stories around it, then please, I encourage you to look at this around lesbians and gays support the miners. And there's a huge connection here between, kind of Welsh Valleys, trade unionist community in the middle of strikes, suddenly understanding and getting to know lesbian and gay campaigners in the 80s. Until then, often the first time people saw or heard of LGBT people was in the newspapers or on TV as stereotypes or associated with things like AIDS or protest or controversy. So the idea that people from those communities would actually encounter gay men and women was kind of mind-blowing. And once people understood and met people as real people, not as their identity or their media portrayed stereotype, suddenly those bridges start to, start to be lowered, the barriers start to be lowered and bridges start to be built. So there is something about getting out in places and letting people see us for who we are that's really powerful. As a gay man, for example, myself, for a very long time as part of the Catholic community, I was either in the closet or just not talking about it at all. And then I made certain assumptions and also received certain amounts of homophobic abuse. And so I withdrew and I thought, oh, do you know what? I don't, maybe Catholicism isn't the place for me, etc., etc. And probably to an extent that's still true as a religion. But actually the people and communities I grew up in, once they actually got to know me, they realized there wasn't anything to be scared of. Because of course there wasn't. And some of those bridges were built again. This is a really hard one. And that's because a lot of that can sometimes feel like we're asking people in minoritized communities to do the heavy lifting. And I'm aware of that. And I don't know the answer to that one, apart from to say that if we're building supportive, protecting communities, which is what platform would always go to, that maybe it's about working out, well, how do we support each other? How do we make it so that we're not asking people who are most impacted by something to do the heavy lifting? The sad reality for me is that often it's the people who are directly impacted by something that are the ones who start campaigns. So for me, there is, something around there about the traditional conversation around being an ally. How do you do that? I have had those conversations with Catholics in my community growing up, and yeah, sometimes it was a huge amount of pain, and other times it went really well. I think for me, it's about being aware of the tension of asking communities to do the heavy lifting, but also making sure people feel supported and they have the space to do that in a way that they know that they can step away from it if they need. The fundamental point, though, is that it makes a difference for people to see you who you are and not who other people say you are. That actually there is so much more that unites us than divides us. And I know, again, that becomes a big cliche, but often if you think about local, if we take this to a local area, for example, in terms of a lot of the protests you might see sometimes about opening up a supported accommodation unit in a local community, a lot of the time there are assumptions made about people we support, which are just not true. So it's about how do we actually get people to meet people as they are. So there's been lots of examples, particularly in Wales, when I used to work at Cymorth, of local housing associations and service providers actually getting people to meet the residents, for example. And finally, for the Connection Makes Change, it's about if you can't meet people on an individual basis, and if you can't meet people kind of as a community basis, then stories can help you meet people on a national or an international basis. And again, if you look at the Me Too movement, the extent to which it has changed the patriarchal society's approach to women, I'm not sure. I think I've read lots of different things. Some people very much agree, some people very much disagree. However, it did something. At the very minimum, it did something. It got women sharing their stories, and it got some men, at least at the very minimum, feeling uncomfortable or feeling that something should happen or there being some moves towards justice. Has it materialized in a sea change? No, but those stories cannot be hidden again. And there are certain things that used to be kind of white noise, the background that women would be used to, that is just not necessarily the case anymore. So again, with campaigns, it's not always A plus B equals C. Remember, it's complex, but certainly the genie from this particular bottle will not be put back in the bottle easily. And that's because women are sharing their stories and will always now have the ability to share those stories and hopefully be listened to more. So what have I learned trying to adopt some of this within platform? So the first thing is it's hard because I do naturally, I want to go to fixing things, but it just isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's not possible, especially in times of austerity or in times where you have governments that don't listen or where you have services that are really struggling. It isn't always the answer, but also it's not possible. So the risk there with campaigning is that we give up, or that we go, well, we can't actually get an extra 5 billion into XYZ, so what's the point? it also doesn't fit neatly into a Gantt chart. I think I said this earlier. If you're trying to work relationally and trying to meet people where they are and trying to understand what they're feeling, you can't plan that out. You can kind of plan when you have conversations, you can kind of plan when you deliver a leaflet, or, but actually it's not always easy to fit into a Gantt chart. I've learned that sometimes platform stakeholders don't always understand. So, if people want a big bells and whistles campaign with really hard-hitting slogans, and platforms say, well, yes, you can have some of that because there's a real important role that has to play, but also we want to talk to people. We want to listen. We want to sit with them. Actually, people who are expecting a big media noise might not necessarily like that. For me, this is a very policy person thing to say. I write a lot of consultations. It's really difficult to do a basic policy response now because I have the voices of all the psychologists I work with going, well, it's not, it's complex, it's complex, it's complex. So gone are the days where I could respond to a policy consultation and say, we need X, Y, Z, more money, and that's it. Political culture is the big challenge. I'm sure there'll be some of you watching this today going, yeah, but what if a politician is actively trying to hurt my community? What if politicians aren't listening? What if a politician takes some risks and then is attacked by the opposition? Or what if a politician says, do you know what, this is going to be hard and difficult, but then he'll feature or she'll feature on the front page of the Sun? Yes, absolutely. Political culture is the big challenge. But what I would always bring you back to is when people make those personal connections. If you'd said to someone in the 90s that Paul Dacre would be having Stephen Lawrence's Killers on the front page of the Daily Mail, people would probably laugh at you. And actually, the fact that we don't talk about it that much since means they would probably still find it hard to believe even now. But personal connection can make the difference. And the reason I also believe that, even though it's hard, and I don't know the answer, is that when you see politicians stand down, suddenly you see what people actually think of them as politicians. And invariably, unless they are particularly bad, invariably the comments are warm, welcoming, and decent. And that's because actually most politicians understand each other and care about each other, even if they vehemently disagree. And critically, this is one for Platform and me, is you don't always get the credit or the attention. So, if Platform is having conversations and there's a particular campaign group that is actually doing more than we are in an area, I don't need Platform to get any credit. But as a policy person who used to get reviewed and, judged on kind of how successful we were, that's quite difficult to fight against those feelings. But when it works, it really works. And when you build a movement, it's powerful. So it's not just me then. It's not me beavering away in my office at home or in the office in work going, oh, I need to do this response. I need to respond to this politician. Suddenly you turn around and another 5 people have started putting something similar in. It might not be in exactly the words you'd use. It might not be the exact message you want, but it's similar enough. And again, building on that new power approach. It's like, do you know what? If there's more people saying a broadly similar thing, we will make a change. The relationships you build are stronger as well. So you might have less of them. You will have less of them. But the ones you build are stronger. You will trust them more because people understand that you're being honest. People understand that you're trying your best and you're not just going to take their words and use them in a quick slogan. You're actually going to really sit down and work on it. It can be liberating, proportional to the challenge I've put. So, I used to sit down and write policy responses and, respond to campaigns or put out leaflets. And sometimes I'd be like, oh, this feels a bit rubbish, or I'm not really inspired by this, or, is this really the big issue we need to talk about? And now at Platform, I feel that actually, if that doesn't inspire us, if that's not important, if that's not going to make a difference to someone, then we just don't do it. And that is massively liberating, and the policy responses are richer. So even though I said in the previous slide that policy responses can't be basic anymore, do you know what? I do fewer of them, but the ones I do, I really enjoy doing because they are actually saying something that I feel are meaningful. And the final bit there is you start feeling connected to different types of power as well. So a lot of the time our campaigns are geared towards politicians, specifically politicians or other pressure groups. But actually, when you're reaching out to different networks or different kind of local mutual aid groups or campaigning groups, you feel connected to a different type of power, people who think differently, people who are diverse in the way they approach things. And that, again, feels massively, massively powerful and really inspiring as well. So this is a really quick example, and I'll move on to some local things now in the last few minutes before I open up for questions. This is the introduction to our response to the Finance Committee in the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, which is very much just the introduction. As you can see, we've never submitted a response. I've never written a response like that in all my time responding as an organisation. And the context for that is we were campaigning for the Welsh Government budget was the worst in recent living memory since devolution, a huge number of cuts because of various global factors and possibly national factors, but otherwise we're during elections, so we'll be careful. So as a result, the Senedd had to implement a significant amount of cuts. And generally, I kind of knew that a consultation response wasn't going to make any impact. I knew that lots and possibly hundreds of organisations would be responding, and we would all be talking about how our area of public sector or public services was more important than the other ones. And I was trying to write it for 5 or 6 weeks, and then I finally spoke to Jen, and I said, I'm struggling, Jen, this is, what's the point? Like, this is just the absolute worst budget we're going to see. I've lost hope. I don't understand how we can, we've got people delivering services and they're exhausted, they're at breaking point, and that's not just platform, that's across everyone. I said, what's the point? And she said, well, write that then. And I went, oh, I mean, yeah, but you can't just write that because, and she went, well, why not? And I was like, well, I'll try it. And it flowed. It was like someone had pressed the permission button or the go button or turned the taps on, and that was the opening of our response. And we, through part of a huge campaign led by lots of other organisations, so Platform was not the organisation that did it, we were a small part of a very big campaign, but we did have feedback from people within that committee to say, don't underestimate the impact that response had on people. So actually, by listening to my feelings, by really channeling I suppose what I want to just express is, do you know what, this is hard, and what you've seen there is I've recognised it's hard for the actual politicians as well. What we didn't do is attack the politicians. We understood that would be so hard for politicians to be making those cuts, because politicians are humans, and with some particular notable exceptions, politicians don't go into politics to hurt people. That might be a controversial statement, and we can chat about it after, but generally you don't become a politician to hurt people. So the fact that people would be presiding over those things is really important. So what I tried to do there with this response, a very small part of it, was acknowledge what they're feeling, and as along with a mix of other things, it made a real difference. So leads us on to, what does this work then locally? So you're sitting here watching, going, oh, that's all really interesting, but what do we do locally? Well, gather stories in partnership with people and tell them together. So don't take people's stories and use them unless they want you to, but sit people together. So if you've got someone you're supporting who's really struggling with the DWP, or is really struggling with time-limited support sessions, or there's issues with their supported accommodation, or the local shops are adopting private security force, which is moving people sleeping rough on, whatever the situation is that you might want to campaign on, actually, if you gather people's stories and start telling them together, it's really powerful. Critically, to map the relationship you and colleagues have. So remember, it doesn't all need to be you, and it can be colleagues from different organisations as well. And that can be really powerful, because one of the things I love doing in Platform is working with other support providers, even if we're competing, because if Platform and other organisations are speaking with the same voice, then that's really powerful, especially if it's two of you together. Speaking with values, sometimes you won't have a solution, and that's okay, actually, but if you speak with values and you try and connect with people, you try and say, look, this is still a problem, then that could be really powerful as well. create a current, not currency. So that's linked to the new power. So instead, rather than trying to control everything, rather than trying to say, oh, well, we're going to do that story then, and then this person's going to do that story, instead, just let people have the freedom to campaign with their own voices. And you will see it feels much more scary. It definitely does, because you might not feel as in control of it as you would want to. But those stories unleashed can be, again, really powerful. Connecting experience to expertise is also really powerful. So a lot of the time, expertise, however we define that, is held in positions of power, and experience is often held in positions of powerlessness. So one of the things we can do as support providers, or whatever our roles is act as a bridge. And that doesn't mean translating for people. That doesn't mean taking their stories and sanitizing it or making it bearable. What that means is saying, look, this is the experience which is ground down with powerlessness, and this is expertise which is awash with power. Let's get the two together. Let's get power hearing powerlessness, and maybe from that change will come. Campaigns are unique to place and space. So, there's no point delivering a campaign based on coffee mornings and getting politicians or local people to meet you if you don't have any coffee shops in your area. There's no point doing a walk to raise awareness of something in your local area if you don't have any green spaces. So you have to understand the places and people you're campaigning with. Don't make campaigners the experts, because the best campaigns are led by people. That's kind of what I said. Let go a little bit. Let people go out. If you're supporting someone, they feel really passionately about something, well, facilitate them as much as is needed and no more to tell their story. Don't neglect the traditional. Letter writing still works. Petitions still work. Going to committees and speaking powerfully still works. Writing to your local MP still works. Getting your local media or national media still works. But it works alongside conversation and connection. The two together will make a huge difference. Understanding peaks and troughs. So this is something I remember from my old drama teacher in GCSE, and has stayed with me along with one of my favorite bits of advice is, people, when you're acting or doing anything in life, if you're always shouting or always whispering or always talking normally, people will eventually filter you out. It becomes white noise. So any campaign needs a mix of pitches. So you need your anger, because that's about taking charge. That's about setting boundaries. That's about saying, no, this is really important. You cannot do this to our community anymore. We will not put up with it. That's really important. At the same time, if it's that all the time, eventually people can blot you out. I'm not saying that's okay. I'm not saying it should happen. This is just me being really honest, that if we don't modulate how we are in terms of campaigns, it gets really hard. Now, this links back to that very first thing when I talked about the burden that often falls upon people with lived experience. And that's why this is so important, because actually, if people take meaning and healing from being angry because of injustice that has been done to a particular community over years or centuries, it's really important we don't tell them they need to modulate. If people are angry, they are angry for a legitimate reason. Let them be angry. As professionals then, if that's what we are in this situation, it's okay for us then to be conciliatory or facilitating or talking or building relationships. It's about building a mix of voices. And then symbols and stories are powerful, so keep using them. And then the final thing for me in terms of some practical ideas is, it is always better, always better to try and to lose than not to try at all. Because if you don't try, if those stories don't get heard at all, nothing will change at all. So it's always better to campaign than not to try. And these are, I will finish because I want to make sure we've had time for questions, but this is, for example, just a snapshot of a local authority area. Now, lots of local structures, local authorities are different, but this is generally the template way in which local authorities work. Some of you will know this, some of you won't, and that's fine. So I'm not going to go into detail, but each ward in the local authority, sorry, each local authority is split into wards. So every person in the United Kingdom will have a local councillor. Within that local authority, some of those councillors will form a cabinet and some of them will be a lead member or a cabinet member. So there will always be someone in a local area of a local authority which will be in charge of social care or housing or public health or whatever their role is. Almost all local authorities will then have what's called a scrutiny committee, which is chaired by another local authority member. So those scrutiny committees are there, the clues in the name without being patronising, that they are there to scrutinise the local authority. Sometimes very ineffective because they're often made up of the same party they're scrutinising, but generally they are there to call into question or to challenge or to review decisions that have been made. In addition, these are the ones that we most often work with as providers. You'll have your officials or your officers. So they're the people who will commission our services, but they are answerable to the cabinet members. They are answerable to, and their questions are scrutinised by the chair. Then you've got your local party members who will help campaign for each of those councillors. So actually, if there's a particular local decision that is really difficult for the people you're supporting or for you yourself, suddenly you've got a whole range of people you can actually talk to. And somewhere in this list of people, somewhere in this list of people, there will be at least one or two that you can have a personal connection with. Someone in that whole mix of people, because we're talking here at least 30 or 40 different people minimum, there'll be someone who knows someone who's experienced something that you're going through. Often we see the council or the cabinet member or the official or the officer as the only factor that we can use to drive change. But if we start breaking it out and doing these relationship maps and going, oh, I wonder if that person delivers a lot of leaflets for the local party, they must know the cabinet member. I wonder if we could have a chat to them and say, do you know what's happening with the day centre here? Are you aware? And they might go, oh God, no, I'll talk to them. And they'll talk to them as people, not as politicians. Because when you see some of the most powerful speeches made by politicians in the House of Commons or in local authorities, they are always about things that matter to them the most. And that's not to say that they're selfish, that's because they're bringing their personal stories. So some of the changes, for example, around childhood bereavement, bereavement of young parents led by people like just forgotten the name, but anyway, some of the significant, quite local but really powerful changes that have been made in the House of Parliament, even during the years of austerity, have been made because people understand it or they've gone through things together. So use that, really make a difference. Thank you. I will stop sharing. I know that's a lot to take in. I'm pretty sure we'll be sharing the slides after, but any questions people have or observations or yeah. I will stop talking, open the floor. Or some advice if someone's got an issue that they want to chat about. I'm happy to do that as well.
I just wanted to say that was really interesting and great delivery. Thank you. It was really engaging. So thank you so much. And I really liked what you were saying about the process being really important. I've noticed that recently, how you can start doing something for a reason and actually the almost side effects of it are actually just as useful as the reason you started doing it, and people can find the process really healing. So yeah, that really resonated. And I guess the other thing that I'm just thinking about is how your kind of values and your way of being that you're talking about in terms of campaigning obviously feel right, and just how you do that in a system, as you kind of mentioned, that is all about sound bites, short-term plans, and kind of grabbing attention. And I guess it's as you kind of alluded to, it's a little bit about maybe satisfying a little bit of that because you kind of have to, and then using that as a hook to kind of pull people to a new way of doing things once you've kind of established that connection. So yeah, that feels really important. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And a good reminder just to not always I think when you're feeling angry, either because you feel passionate, not just stepping into antagonistic mode and anger, because that can feel quite natural, can't it? So that was a really helpful reminder.
Yeah, those are really, really good points. I think in terms of the culture, the political culture we're in around sound bites and 45-second responses, and it is really hard. And the I can never remember. There's the old 80s film about the Cold War, and it says the only winning move is not to play. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, there's anyway, I'm very nerdy and I love my Cold War films. I just can't remember what they're called. But that's kind of almost our approach within platform at the moment is, is actually, it's not, if everyone else is shouting aggressive soundbite 45-second responses, we're just trying not to play that game. Yes, of course, we sometimes need to be strong and take charge. We still need to have anger. Anger is important, especially in the face of injustice. But as platform, as our organization, we're trying to change the way we chase that, and trying to think really differently about, well, how do we make that difference? What's actually effective? And there was something powerful you said right at the end, yes, around letting the process sort of play out. And I had had exactly that experience when we were campaigning on housing support grant funding in Wales. I spoke to two of our colleagues in platform who were leading services, and they were just distraught. It is for everyone, across the UK, a difficult time. Services are overwhelmed, distressed, people are really struggling. And we had this conversation, and they were talking about the kind of things they experience every day. And they were really emotional. And I was, I finished the call and I was thinking, everything in my being, absolutely, I just wanted to promise them that I could fix it, and I was, the policy person in me was going, what's the solution, what's the answer, and I was getting myself really upset about it, but I listened and I just, sat with it. As cliche as that sounds, I was like, oh, this is not about you. This is about you listening to them and their distress and understanding what they're going through. And at the end I said, look, I'm really sorry, I can't promise anything. And they just went, no, we know. And then afterwards I got 2 separate emails within about half an hour to say thank you. That's really helped. We know that you can't do anything necessarily, but just hearing it and knowing it's going to be told to politicians has just helped us more than anything you could have said. And that for me was a big learning, because the act of talking was healing in itself, and it didn't matter what else happened from that point.
Yeah, and I think that's really useful as well, like to remember there can be a distinction between like people being personally angry, which is very, very, very justified and actually really important kind of impetus, but then also as a professional or as an organization holding that and not like stepping right into it and being that as well. That feels like a really useful distinction. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's really good. And sometimes it's good to just step back and think about what we're doing and why and how, which often we're in the middle of things and don't have the opportunity to do that. So thank you. That's given me the opportunity to do that this morning. I was just sort of thinking about, I've been around sort of homelessness for a long, long time. And one of the things I've been saying to frontline staff and leaders of other local homeless agencies is that sometimes we have to just accept that things go round in a circle. And at the moment, things are really bad, but they will come back round again. And sometimes when people come up with what they are portraying or thinking of new ideas, sometimes I want to say, actually, we did that before, and either we did it before and it didn't work, so what's the point of trying it again? Or yeah, we did that before and absolutely it worked, and obviously we should have carried on doing it, but things changed and we didn't. And just having that perspective sometimes is quite useful, because I think particularly at the moment it feels like there's so much pressure, and the funding cuts and the effects of those funding cuts on individuals and on services, but just having that faith that things will come around, and if we can keep doing the right things and working in the right way, it will come around and we will get that opportunity to influence things again in the future to get them back on track where we'd like them to be. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It definitely does, and it reminds me of this beautiful quote, and I heard it again, I think, from one of President Obama's quotes, and I think he was quoting someone else, and he talked about the arc of history is long, but it tends towards justice. And which means when you step out and you look at the progress we've made as a society, yes, it's been jagged and there's been steps backwards and we've lost people and things and communities along the way, and you know, it's come with gut-wrenching pain and huge effort and sacrifice, but the trajectory has been towards justice. And when I first heard it, I loved it, but also got a bit peed off, because I was like, oh, so nothing we've done matters. The arc is just trending towards justice. Fine, great. It's all economic statistics. Actually, what is meant by that is that arc is being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed by activists and people along the way. So what you're talking about, Amanda, in terms of seeing it come full circle, and you know, I can see it, and I've, you know, I'm only 36, I've already seen things come full circle, and you know, there's that sense, I think, of exhaustion, of burnout, of feeling broken within the sector. And so what we need to make sure we do is we just push where we can, as much as we can, with who we can, to keep that arc moving forward. And if sometimes we need to take our hand off the arc and let someone else push, then we need to do that, you know. And I think the biggest thing for me to date is kind of, not that imparting like some kind of wise person, that's not what I mean at all, but is to remember that we need to look after ourselves and the people we support, and that sometimes it's okay to step back a little bit when needed, as long as we then, you know, dust ourselves back off and then go back in and keep pushing. Because yes, that arc does not push itself. It's not it's not a passive economic line. It is a hugely active human line that has come with real struggle. So we need to keep pushing, basically. And if we keep pushing, it will change, because it has. We know that it's working, because things are so much different. When I grew up, born in 1987. When I grew up, my teachers saw me being attacked and bullied in the class because I was gay, and said nothing, because there was a law that said that they couldn't. And now that isn't imaginable, that would happen. So in just those few years, we've seen massive change. So let's keep going, is what I would always say to that, as difficult as it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Anthony.
I was going to put my hand down, but you basically just answered what I was going to say. Or I was going to say, I got, you know, the sort of stuff that we're looking at here is generational, isn't it? And how do we keep hope? And you basically just answered it. You know, I was talking about, going to say about your manifesto and the changes you guys want, well, we all want to see around mental health, you know, the changes I want to see around the drug laws, you know, embedding that trauma framework in Wales. They're all generational things, aren't they? And yeah, that's what I was going to say. So yeah, and I guess the other bit about it is, you know, I like, you know, I'm always talking about relationships in the work that I do, and you know, the way that you've tied the relational aspect into that campaign and stuff is really good. You know, that last bit there, when you think about it, actually, yeah, there's probably going to be 40, 45 people in this little town. Somebody's going to know someone. You know, I'm from Aberystwyth, and I got, you know, if I think back there, I know I could probably say, oh, he knows such and such in the council. You can get your piece in there, right? So yeah, very good.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes time, you know, but I'm laughing because I've just had a realization as I'm talking, which has helped. So my thinking is this. So our platform, we've talked about probably not achieving the change we want to see in the mental health system for the next 30, 40, 50 years, by which time, you know, I'm above a certain weight, I'm diabetic and disabled. I might not see it, although I'm hopeful, but, you know, let's be honest. So, you know, that's fine, because it means some of the pressure is off initially. You know, whew, I don't have a yearly target, so I've got 30, 40, 50-year-old targets. But I also, and still do, sometimes get really despondent and a bit kind of down about it, because I'm like, oh, I've got this vision of a beautiful world in my head and I'm not going to see it. But actually, the thing that you've just made me think is working relationally, understanding people's relationships, understanding who to talk to, understand who's got lived experience, understand who understands X, Y, Z. That takes time. So actually, if you're trying to achieve change in 5 years, which is what politicians try and do, you can't be relational, can you? You can't get to know, or who, you know, actually I've got 30, 40, 50 years of this, so I can take my absolute time to do it. And that's the realization I've just had. And that's not to be blasé and relaxed, because, you know, the thing that keeps me up is, you know, people's lives are dependent on this change. But that is also about trying to be realistic. You know, if I burn myself out trying to change things in 4 years, and it still won't change, I'll just be broken. So, you know, it's about that self-care. It's about understanding who we need to talk to and when. So yeah.
I was just thinking when you were talking, then maybe it is like you were talking earlier about the changes that have happened since since you were in school and all that sort of stuff. Like that maybe there's some value in properly creating that, isn't it? So like like for these long-term things, we can sort of say, well, look, this is where we started, and if we've got, I mean, I don't go back all the way back in time, sort of thing, but like when we started looking at this, we built this relationship. This thing has changed slightly, like the trauma framework, for example, in Wales, that probably wouldn't have happened a few years ago, would it? If you get in the Welsh government saying we believe this is a problem and we need to address it at a national level. So I suppose it is maybe sort of together creating that the sort of slow changes that we're making and having that handy to show people. That's when they do become despondent, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. No, and that's what I try and remind myself of. If I come home grumpy and down, or I see something on the news that I just think, oh God, I just have to find something that gives me that hope, And often that's by talking to people like everyone on the call today. Always leave with a good, happy buzz. So find your people, find your network, find your well of power. Tonya?
I just wanted to say really two things. I just wanted to comment on how inspiring I found this whole session. So thank you very much for that. And particularly the letter that you'd written as well. And I could really see how you kind of tapping into your own authenticity and your values made that really, really impactful. It was really wonderful. And the second thing is I was thinking about how I agree that we often ask the most marginalized people to kind of carry the weight of doing a lot of this work. But then when you link that in with the circle of security, I just thought, wow, that's such an important factor for us to be thinking about, because it is that circle of security that will create situations in which people can feel empowered and then come back then to that nurturing environment as well. So I was just really moved by that, I think. I'm very grateful for you sharing it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that's a really important point, because I think we do ask people to share stories, precisely because we all know they're powerful. But exactly that, if we've got that circle of security around them, so we know, look, with your permission and entirely led by you, your story might make a difference. So go out on that circle and we'll provide you as much support as you want to go out and tell your story. But we are still here when you come back. You're not just left with it and the legacy, because, yes, stories can be healing, but they can also be harmful. And sometimes you need to make sure people are there to pick up pieces if it isn't received well, or if it doesn't change. People, we're all human beings, and if you tell your story and it doesn't have change or experience change, or people don't comment on it, they could be really, 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 really harmful and destabilizing. So yeah, that would encourage everyone to look at that circle, whatever approach they adopt. We're not in the business in platform saying you must use the circle model. That's not what we do. But certainly we absolutely would say you need to make sure you're listening to and supporting the people you're asking to tell their story in whatever format or whatever medium.
Yeah, nice.
Great. Any more questions? I think I don't see anything else on the chat, so I will. We've got till 11:30 then for our reflective session. So normally, just in case this is your first time today, we normally have sort of an hour. I've overrun. I'm so sorry, Mary. She can tell me off later in a very relational way. We normally go do sort of an hour and a bit of the presentation. Then we have a 10-minute break and come back for between half an hour for an hour of reflection on either what we've heard today or just anything else from People Services they want to bring. So what I was going to suggest is if we break now for 10 minutes, come back at 11, and those of us who are there, we can go through the reflective practice. But what I will say before we start recording is absolutely thank you so much for your kind words and for listening and bearing with me as I talk in exhaustive detail about campaigning. Always happy to chat more if you're doing anything locally in your areas that you're campaigning on and you want platform either to support with or know about, or you want any support or advice, then feel free to drop me a line. I'm always happy to chat. And thank you very much.